Hi, it's Frank. Today I'm going to be talking about secondary dominants. So the idea behind a secondary dominant is that any chord in a major or minor key, any triad, can be preceded by a chord that is either dominant or dominant seventh. This also applies to diminished chords, meaning diminished or diminished seventh chord. And the reason for that has to do with what was originally thought of as modulation. That is to say, how to treat modulation. I think I've mentioned in previous videos that to modulate in music means to go from one key to the next. That is to say, you pick a key you're starting on C, and then you decide that you also want to play part of this song in G. So by doing that, you're pulling in two different tonal centers. And the way you go about modulating is establishing how that tonal center should sound. Again, we'll save modulation and exploring that for some other day. But for now, I just want to bring that simple definition in, meaning moving from one key to the next, because that's in essence what we're working with when we're using secondary dominants. It's not that we're modulating officially. In fact, a way to think of secondary dominants is to think of them as allowing for some sort of transient modulation, where there's the sense that you're moving through another key, but you're not officially in it yet. They essentially serve to embellish or really augment the sound that your ear is leading you toward. If the next chord coming sounds like it's being preceded by a chord that makes the chord you're about to arrive at that much more important sounding, then there is a sense that you're arriving somewhere, even though you're not. So I would say perhaps in some sense it's maybe a little deceptive, but to 21st century ears like ours, it really doesn't sound so much like that anymore. Rarely is there a progression you're going to hear now that really surprises you in that way just because of secondary dominance. Having said that, they can still make an otherwise boring or routine progression sound really exciting, by comparison anyways. As an example of that, I'm just going to first of all mention that a secondary dominant for us, again, is just a major triad, because recall that when we're in any key, C for instance, the dominant chord in that case would be a G chord that consists of the G, B as in boy, D as in dog. Again, working just with triads there. So C major, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth note is G, that's a major triad, and that's a dominant chord in that key. So in that key, if you heard a G or G7 chord, it wouldn't really sound odd, but what it would help to do is set your expectation to somehow move back towards the note C. That's exactly what secondary dominants are so good at. And again, you can use this also with diminished chords. For now, I'm going to focus more on the dominant part of it, but it works the same way. The idea is you're helping drive the listener's ear towards an expectation that is then either only partially resolved or isn't resolved at all, because you want that suspense, that feeling of suspense that comes with using that secondary dominant to remain. So I'm going to use a progression that I talked about recently in just the last video, in fact. That progression, if you watched, had to do with 1, 6, 2, 5. And the idea there was, if I'm again in the key of C as I was in that video, two of those chords, since we're all diatonic for the purposes of this, two of those chords were minor and two of those chords were major. So the one was major, that was C, tonic. We went to our submediant, which in this key would be A minor. Then, for the 2 chord, recall we went to D as in dog minor. That's our supertonic chord as it's labeled. And then, once again, as already mentioned, the dominant chord is G. Now, for now, I'll go ahead and make that G7. So when we put that together, we have C, A minor, D minor, G7. Progression you've heard countless times, I'm sure, even if you haven't recognized it. But the idea is that was the 1, 6, 2, 5 I described in the previous video. So now with secondary dominants, we open up the possibility of heightening the sensation of that progression, even with just those 4 basic chords that you've heard many times before. By heightening, I mean to say changing the listener's expectations a little bit. Because every time we use a 5 or a 5-7 chord, we're pushing through the use of notes that are borrowed from another key, the listener's ear towards that next chord more intently. That is to say, it's literally just forcing you to acknowledge what could be a change, a modulation to some different key. It's not, and again, I got to stress that. The idea with this is there's a transience involved. It just helps move the ear along in a specific direction by providing a greater thrust in that direction. So let's go ahead and look at some chords in this key so that we can see what I'm talking about. So if I went ahead and took that C chord and then went to the A minor, when I got to the D, instead of playing it as a D minor, if I made that a D major, I would be introducing a key that's not normally, note that's not normally in this key. That's by way of the F sharp. Let's also look at what that means as I'm moving from that chord to the next chord. So D minor has among its notes F. That's the third of the chord. D major, by contrast, takes that note, moves it a half step up to F sharp. Now, in this sequence, 1, 6, 2, 5 in the key of C, the next chord then would be the G chord. I picked this because everything's pretty easy to see on that first string, and this chromatic movement is exactly what I wanted to highlight. The idea is, instead of just sticking with the D minor and using that F as the high note, D major allows me to use the F sharp, which is a half step below G, the root of the next chord. Anytime you move within a half step of the root of the chord you're about to land on, meaning you start a half step below it, move up to it, the feeling of moving to that chord is intensified. Doesn't mean you've suddenly changed keys just because I've borrowed a note from another scale. It just means that I am actually driving your ear more intently toward that next chord. So the embellishment, the feeling of movement is intensified. Let's just put it like that. So once again then, if I did that, C, A minor, D, G, sounds like momentarily I could have meant to arrive and stay on G. But if I continue my progression by going back to C, it sounds like I still got back to a tonic, a resting place. Especially if the D went to a 7 and then to the C. That was a little chromatic movement in reverse, so to speak. That is to say, D7 here, D major here, then went to the third, seventh of the G7 chord, which is an F, which is a half step below it, then to E. So F sharp to F natural to E. So instead of going up in that case, I went down using just chord tones, the ones I just talked about when I went from C to A minor to the D major, G7, E. So those little movements of 3 or 4 chromatic notes really help guide the listener's ear, especially when they're arranged in such a way where they're standing out on the higher or lower strings. Those tend to be most prominent when it comes to directing listeners' attention. Now, if I take that D chord and make it a D7 chord, you're going to notice that the feeling will intensify a little bit more. That is to say, C, A minor, D as in dog 7, G7, C. Familiar at all with the song Rocky Raccoon? That just popped into my head because that is exactly the kind of thing that Paul McCartney does in that song as he's strumming along with the acoustic and singing. There's a succession of dominant seventh chords that are moving, that are pushing the listener's ear toward that next chord with a little more intensity because of the use of those dominant sevenths. Now I can actually add to this effect by taking that other chord, the A, instead of A minor, instead of making it major, making it A7. Another dominant seventh chord. If I do that, then I'm moving through 4 chords, 3 of which are all dominant seventh chords. C, tonic, A7, D as in dog 7, G7, C. Again, a progression you probably heard a lot whether you recognized it or not. But each of those dominant seventh chords set up the next chord as a possible landing point, meaning a point where you're going to cadence and say, hey, now we've arrived at something, when in fact that was just setting you up for the next chord, and so on and so forth until we got back to the C. Now each time we do that, instead of referring to a progression like that simply as 1, 6, 2, 5, even though the low notes correspond to that, so C is the low note for the first chord, A is the 6, D is the second, the supertonic, G is the dominant, the 5th. Instead of just saying it that way, we would start to describe those secondary dominants as 5 of something. So in this case, the C chord as tonic going to A7 would actually be thought of as a 5, meaning the A7 is a 5-7 of the 2 chord, because that's the next chord that you would expect to hear in this particular progression. But instead of getting just a minor chord, we get that D7. That's okay. So even though I described the A7 as a 5 of 2 and it went to a D7, that root movement of A to D in this key still sounded like the movement of 6 to 2. And that meant going either up a 4th or from A down a 5th to D. Root movement matters a lot when we're describing progressions. The other thing I haven't mentioned a lot, but the truth is we're getting to that territory now where it's good to be aware of that kind of root movement, meaning the lowest note of each chord, not just the key. So that A7 then is functioning in this case, we would say, as a 5 of 2. The D7 is itself changed because it's not D minor, and now that's functioning as a 5 of 5, and specifically 5-7. And then, of course, G7 is just the 5-7 chord of this key. So what I had was a series of dominant seventh chords, dominant chords specifically, but that happen to mostly be seventh, that are moving in a specific direction, meaning a progression I'd already described, 1, 6, 2, 5. But because I've changed how I'm using them, made them all the dominant seventh chords, they now have the idea of slightly blurring the tonality. And again, we're not changing into a new key. We're not modulating into a new key. We're not establishing a strong tonal center that involves, either A minor or D or G or anything like that. We're still in the key of C. But the secondary dominants have made it sound a little more interesting as we're moving between tonic toward dominant and then back to the tonic. So that's the fun part about using secondary dominants. And again, the same kind of rules, so to speak, apply when we're using diminished chords. We pick a root of a chord that we're moving toward and start a half step below it with a diminished or diminished seventh chord. The listener's ear is driven toward that next chord with greater intensity. That is really the point of the secondary dominants. Okay, so that's enough talk about that. For the next video, I will go ahead and put together a little chord melody piece using some secondary dominants so you can see them in action. Have a great week.